I think that's something I continue to hear in the industry is, should we just be sampling all the blood that's coming into the market facilities, because, that might give us a good clue. And when we think back to the PED era and we look back at some of the plasma, it
Right.
started to let us know when it actually came into the US versus maybe when we were truly seeing it in the industry in terms of clinical symptoms. So I think that's important to really continue to discuss that surveillance and,
Yep.
How often and how frequently are we checking various parts of the country?
Yep.
Because I think, again, we argue, well, if you're in Iowa or North Carolina where there's pig heavy areas, then we're doing a lot more surveillance there just by sheer number versus maybe other parts of the United States. And I think that's concerning to people, is that, well, what if it sneaks in these areas that maybe aren't being sampled as frequently just because of numbers of pigs in a location? Is there any way that we can maybe talk about how we should do surveillance when we think about just pig population density?
So we've been looking at some models that address that issue. What happens if African swine fever shows up in a pig dense area as opposed to a less dense area? And we're not finished, but the preliminary analyses make it look like it doesn't really matter too much where the virus shows up, because eventually that producer he's going to have some kind of interaction with another producer or with the packing plant. And so you've got, from our models, it looks like you've got a period of about 35 days when it's going to smolder. After 35 days is when things really start taking off. And so that's why for us, a few samples from lots of herds is pretty sensitive. If we can find that smoldering hotspot and stomp it out before it gets any further, that's going to be the key. Mm-hmm. In terms of sampling and slaughter, we actually have really effective methods for sampling and slaughter. Oral fluids work pretty well. Pigs in lairage are perfectly happy to chew on a rope. We can get oral fluids from them pretty well. And I can't speak for the packing industry or for packers, but I know that I would prefer to have African swine fever detected before it gets to my plant, because if it gets to my plant, I've got to shut it down, decontaminate. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be complex, and it's going to be costly. So if we as an industry can detect our problems before they get to the packing plant, we're going to be much better off. We don't want packing plants to close. That's going to create big problems for us. There are places that are talking about collecting samples at slaughter. Latin America, I've talked to some people in Latin America, and for them, it makes much more sense because they have lots of small packing plants and lots of small producers that they could detect that way. But for us, I think it's probably not a good idea.